I will take you now into a journey across the cardiovascular outcome trials, and you have heard lots of presentation which really perfectly set the stage of your better understanding of the results, and few more are coming actually the day after tomorrow. These are my disclosures. And the question whether decreasing glycated hemoglobin improves outcome, in my opinion, is still open, although we have heard that you may be still convinced that it's good for your patient to decrease glycated hemoglobin. It's certainly good when it comes to microvascular disease, but macrovascular, maybe until the day after tomorrow or some other day, it's still a question mark. It's something to show that there is an epidemiological relationship between glycated hemoglobin and cardiovascular macrovascular disease, but decrease in glycated hemoglobin, whether it produces a decrease in risk, this is an open question, and this actually asks the question whether glycated hemoglobin is a surrogate for macrovascular disease, and this is what we are going to be examining first. Well, there have been meta-analyses here for probably bad meta-analyses, because meta-analyses, you need really to be very careful with meta-analyses, but at least to ring a bell, an alarm, that, well, maybe a diabetes agent can actually increase the risk of cardiovascular events. And this came across these meta-analyses of rosiglitazone, suggesting that 43% increase in myocardial function with this drug and 64% increase in cardiovascular death. Very worrisome. So the health authorities start to worry about that, and they said, we need to do something about it. And the European agency declared that, well, now I need a trial, a prospective, standalone, not a meta-analysis. And this is what had been done with the record trial. And luckily, the outcome was neutral. Well, there is no benefit, but at least no signal of harm overall in cardiovascular death and hospitalization, which was the primary outcome. Now, if you look at the components and other secondary outcome, we have got the signal of excess harm with doubling the risk of new onset heart failure and maybe also bone fracture. So maybe there are still safety issues, but at least this was enough for the European agency to state that benefits no longer outweigh the risk, and then they decided to suspend the drug. This was also the case in the United States. Well, subsequently, the FDA removed some of the restriction of rosiglitazone after further analysis. You have seen some of these analyses earlier today. But it was enough to ring this bell and to have many more studies performed. And these were actually concomitant, maybe before the previous trial I have shown. And if any, these raised even more the concern about harm. So these are drugs which are great for controlling glycated hemoglobin, glucose lowering, but still many of them have been stopped prematurely for harm, and maybe you haven't really heard much about these drugs because it was the end of the journey for some of them. Now, it's really nervous. I'm doing nothing. I'm sorry. So this was enough for the regulatory authorities, and certainly the Food and Drug Administration, which started this, to declare that clinical trial evidence is needed to rule out unacceptable excess of cardiovascular risk before an diabetic drug can be approved. This actually was the end of glycated hemoglobin as a surrogate endpoint. Up to this point, the regulatory authorities could approve drugs just on the basis that they improve glycation control and glycated hemoglobin, but from now on, this is what is mandated. And then in the European agency, they insisted that post-approval need longer, larger trials to establish cardiovascular safety more clearly and evidence of cardiovascular benefit would be a bonus. It would be fine if we have that, and you will have a specific label of cardiovascular prevention. But the focus was only cardiovascular safety of these trials. Then, since then, we have all these trials. You have seen this slide, and you have seen how many patients. Just add up all of these numbers, and you will find out more than 130,000 patients in cardiovascular outcome trials. Most of them are only cardiovascular safety, not necessarily cardiovascular efficiency. So we need to keep that in mind on how long we should go with these trials until we end up the saga of cardiovascular safety alone trial. This is a huge number. Well, on the other side, it's great to have this kind of evidence-based therapy now, and so diabetes is coming into the age of evidence-based therapy. As a cardiologist, I am really lucky to apply evidence-based therapy in cardiology, and I'm happy to have so many more trials coming in the diabetes area, improving the number of data and certainly improving the level of evidence in treating our diabetes patients. So it's good news for diabetology, it's good news for diabetes patients, and certainly also for cardiology. Now, I'd like to cover the trials so far, and these are the trials with DPP-4 inhibitors. 3 of them have terminated, the 2 more to come. Essentially, they are very, very, very similar with some exceptions. The only single exception here actually is examined because it has addressed patients with post-acute coronary syndrome, and this is the topic of today. Others were in primary or secondary prevention, but in chronic, stable, at-risk population, the only outlier in terms of inclusion criteria was examined addressing the highest risk population. I will come to that on how big was the risk in this trial. The primary endpoint, and this has been addressed by Jacques Tardif, for some reason, the Food and Drug Administration insisted that they would like to have MACE, major acute cardiovascular events. And this actually is cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, and stroke. Sometime unstable angina has been added as kind of other acute coronary syndrome, but essentially this missed one point, which is heart failure. And this has been missed actually historically in almost all hypertension trials and also in lipid trials, just for one single reason. It's really difficult to diagnose heart failure. Unstable stroke and myocardial infarction are kind of acute event. You can have biomarkers, you can have imaging, and you can really establish the diagnosis on firm. Now, heart failure is sign and symptoms, worsening, dyspnea, something softer. So we elected in the heart failure trials to have heart failure definition as heart failure hospitalization or cardiovascular death. There are 2 ways that heart failure can complicate, is just to get the patient from worsening to the hospital or death. And this has been actually the definition across all these trials as a secondary endpoint. But for some reason, we don't have heart failure in the primary endpoint here. Now, all trials are very similar when it comes to design. They were the active therapy versus placebo on top of usual care. And usual care can be 1, 2, 3 other anti-diabetic medications. So that the end of the day was not the comparison on the magnitude of glucose lowering, because this was not the aim of these. And glucose changes were consequence of also change in background therapy, including the other anti-diabetic therapy which was prescribed at that time. And if any, in all these trials, investigators were encouraged to have work with the other medication in order to optimize glucose control. So don't pay much attention to the change in glycated hemoglobin, although it dropped more in the active arm than in placebo in almost all trials, but we cannot really compare across the trial the magnitude of changes here. So in Examine, I just highlighted this very important feature that patients were enrolled in the trial 2 weeks to 3 months after they have been discharged from acute coronary syndrome, and this needs to be kept in mind. SAVOR-TIMI enrolled different kind of patients. These were patients at lower risk because they were in primary or secondary prevention, accumulating a certain number of cardiovascular risk factor or evidence of some cardiovascular disease as a history. And again, very straightforward versus placebo control. And as a consequence, the numbers are very high because the event rate was lower, and you'll see that later in comparing the risk across the trials. TCOS, very similar to SAVOR-TIMI, essentially the same kind of patient in primary and secondary prevention, chronic, non-post-acute, comparing head-to-head versus placebo and on top of other medication. Very similar design, and by the way, large number of patients as well because lower risk and lower event rate. So how do the three trials compare when it comes to baseline characteristics? Well, actually very great similarity. Age was above 60 in all of them. The history of diabetes for almost 10 years in all, 7 years maybe the most recent in examined. The overweight rate was the same in all trials, and glycated hemoglobin 7 on 8. So very, very great consistency among the trial. The single main difference is because per protocol we had a post-acute coronary syndrome patient population in examined, so that the history of cardiovascular prior myocardial infarction was much larger here than the other trials. And you've got also a history of heart failure, which was very large. 28% of the patient, 1 out of 4 patients had a history of heart failure in examined. So in a way, we have achieved this high-risk population we wanted to target, and this was done on purpose. We hypothesized in examine that if we address this worst-case scenario patient population at very high risk of cardiovascular events, fast remodeling after an acute coronary syndrome, if these patients have a good safety with the new drug, this drug must be safe in other lower risk populations. So we just position ourselves in the worst case situation, and we have achieved this kind of high risk in examine. Well, you are familiar with these results. These were non-inferiority trial, and so therefore the trial met their primary outcome. Non-inferiority was met, and the essentially allogliptin here was totally similar to placebo, no harm, but no benefit either. And you see the mean duration was not that long. We can discuss about that later on the significance of duration of follow-up. Very similar in the SAVOR-TIMI trial, essentially exactly the same result. Well, you can see the shape of the curve is different here, and it tells you about the type of patient population. Here it's strictly linear, and you can measure the 1-year event rate here was 4%, maybe 4.5, as compared to examined, where the event rate was front-loaded, many more events in the first 6 months, because this was a post-acute trial, and the first month after discharge from an acute coronary syndrome is a vulnerable period where you have many more events of heart failure, certainly, but also sudden death and many more. And therefore, you can also calculate here a rough calculation of the 1-year event rate, which was above 8%, so much higher event rate than in SAVOR. So if we go to TCOS, exactly the same situation. The Kaplan-Meier's were totally superimposable, and you can also calculate the event rate. Here from 1 year, it's below 5%. So same kind of ballpark event rate than SAVOR-TIMI. Secondary endpoint, some variation, some added unstable angina, revascularization, some added heart failure as a secondary endpoint, but essentially exactly the same message. Very neutral effect, no matter how you look at the data in examine, very safe. All-cause mortality, no difference. And you can see this in SAVOR-TIMI, where they've added heart failure, by the way, as a secondary endpoint. And we will see later on that taken in isolation, heart failure hospitalization was in excess with saxagliptin, but when it is merged to the combined endpoint, it just disappeared because this was diluted within the large number of events in this composite event. Now you see TCOS as well, secondary endpoint here, which enrolled in addition unstable angina, and essentially exactly the same neutral effect, very safe. How much these trials differed, I couldn't really fit here the annual rate from SAVOR and TCOS, but you have seen it earlier on. It's about to range here. You can here spot the UK PDS event rate, and you see this was low event rate population as compared to EXAMINE. EXAMINE was probably the highest event rate we've seen in the modern area of cardiovascular trial because the per protocol post-acute coronary syndrome, only renal diabetic nephropathy trial had a higher event rate because we know that CKD in this patient population are a very important risk factor. So it's important to have the perspective. If we have to fit SAVOR and TCOS, this would fit in this area most likely. Then the heart failure issue, and I am a heart failure specialist. I have been advocating at the FDA level, and hopefully all of my heart failure colleagues now are going to be getting that heart failure event should be in the primary event, because heart failure is a very common, and if any, it is the commonest cardiovascular event in diabetes. More common, especially in the elderly, than myocardial infarction. Certainly much more common than stroke. But for some reason, this was missed in the primary endpoint. So it's good that we have it in secondary endpoint. And the definition of heart failure was the same, which was actually published as a guidance from the regulatory agencies. And this was the same across all trials. This was hospitalization for heart failure, which required addition of diuretic or initiation of diuretic and overnight stay. So the definition was the same, so that we can compare this outcome across the different trials. And the way to look at heart failure events is to combine heart failure hospitalization and cardiovascular death. This is the composite endpoint we have been using for ages in all heart failure trials. This is the straightforward way to look at the data. And when you looked into these data in EXAMINE, there is total neutrality on heart failure hospitalization and cardiovascular death. This is only heart failure hospitalization. And then if you look at the composite endpoint, and this is how we should look at the data, this is also neutral. Now in SAVOR-TIMI, only heart failure hospitalization as a standalone was increased. For some reason, we have discussed that earlier, whether it is just chance finding or some relationship to hypoglycemia or other things we will probably never know, because we don't have enough data, and this is going to be very highly speculation area. But the bottom line that the curve diverged early enough, and this was the heart failure taken in isolation. When you put it in the composite endpoint with cardiovascular death, the signal is still there, it doesn't disappear. So it appears that this signal is really something true in this population. Whether it is true across all the class of drug, this is unknown and left to your own judgment, because if you add up TCOS, we have also total neutrality on this outcome on heart failure, whether it is taken in isolation or combined with cardiovascular death. So here we have 3 trials with the same category of drug, which, if any, from basic science are cardioprotective. We should have expected some cardioprotection, because in animal studies, all these drugs are positive in cardioprotection. So there is no mechanistic plausibility really to understand the success risk of hypoglycemia, of heart failure. And just taken together, in my own opinion, there is an outlier, which is SAVOR, and which is most likely related to chance finding. And this effect will disappear across time, and probably, hopefully, in the post-marketing surveillance study. Other important adverse event, I know that you, as a diabetologist, are very concerned about pancreas, malignancy, pancreatitis, and these were safe across all three trials. So all these class of drugs are very safe when it comes to these kinds of side effects. But when it comes to hypoglycemia, again, the definition of hypoglycemia was very different across the trials. So it's unfair to say that one drug produces more hypoglycemia than the other, because we cannot compare until we have a head-to-head comparison. But in this examined trial, you see the rates were very little, whether it is serious or any hypoglycemia, and no excess hypoglycemia of allogliptin as compared to placebo. Now, if you go say over TIMI, again, don't look at the absolute numbers and don't compare them to the other trial, because the definition were not the same. What is most important is that there was a statistical significant more hypoglycemia in saxagliptin than in placebo. So again, a matter of speculation whether this high rate of hypoglycemia could have driven the risk of heart failure. We don't really know, but there is some evidence, and you have seen the QT changes and many other evidences that the more hypoglycemia, the higher the cardiovascular risk from many trials comparing intensive glucose control to less intensive glucose control. And of course, pathologically, if you run into hypoglycemia, you have a release in catecholamine in order to get you out of the symptoms of hypoglycemia, and catecholamines are bad for your heart. But again, this is totally speculative. I don't know whether there is any cause-to-effect relationship between this excess hypoglycemia and the excess rate of heart failure. TCOS, totally neutral, low event, no event on pancreatitis, and when it comes to hypoglycemia, we are on very low rate and no excess related to sitagliptin. So, what do we know so far? While no comparison can be made across trials, and you need to be very careful because these were not the same trial population, etc., the trials overall support cardiovascular safety of this class of drugs, but at least with the drugs in this class. But allogliptin was tested in the highest risk post-acute coronary syndrome patient population, while saxagliptin and sitagliptin were tested in patient population with diabetes and stable cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular risk factors. Now, if we have to put examine in perspective with other cardiovascular outcome trials other than DPP-4 inhibitors, we have ELIXA, which has been shown in the American Diabetes Association, not published yet, and soon to come MPERAG in the day after tomorrow, and another SGLT2 inhibitor trial, CANVAS, which is still ongoing. And ELIXA has compared the GLP-1 receptor agonist, lixisenatide, to placebo. The design was very, very similar to EXAMINE. And this is the main reason I'm showing it here, because it addressed the same kind of population, recent acute coronary syndrome, although the time of enrollment was a little later after discharge after acute coronary syndrome, but essentially the same target population of post-acute coronary syndrome. So we do have two trials in post-acute coronary syndrome with two categories of drugs, which essentially show exactly the same result. I don't have the results here because they were not published, but they have been shown in the ADA meeting, and the curves are totally superimposable, very similar to the Kaplan-Meier's you have seen in EXAMINE, total neutrality, no excess harm, no benefit. MPERAG, just a teaser for you to understand better the results, which are going to be shown in 2 days. This essentially compared two doses, and it's important to see how the results are going to be presented on Thursday, whether it's going to be one dose versus placebo or combined doses versus placebo. This is really important for the good understanding and interpretation of the results. And essentially, the patient population were more on the side of SAVOR and TCOS. Primary and secondary prevention, not post-acute, chronic stable population. So look at the patient characteristics. While renal function would be important to interpret here because it does interfere with the mechanism of action of empagliflozin. So look at renal function and subgroup analysis across different degrees of renal function. And canvas is essentially the same, also comparing 2 doses, and this would come much later. And the patient population, again, similar to these chronic stable primary or secondary prevention, not post-acute patients. So this is what we have so far. Baseline characteristics, again, ELIXA examined, very similar because they are post-acute coronary syndrome, but still examined was at high risk just because they had much higher risk of heart failure, for example, and previous myocardial infarction, but they are same kind of type of population, and empiric in canvas on the other side of primary and secondary prevention. There have been a publication of the design paper and the baseline characteristics, but lots of gaps in the description of the population in this primary paper. We need to wait until we see the totality of the data and really to understand this population and to which kind of population you would extrapolate the result of these trials. So here is what we are with how best to improve cardiovascular outcome in diabetes patients. Well, certainly you have heard from Jean-Claude Tardif that the best service you can do to your diabetes patient is to get them onto a statin, to get them on antiplatelet drug, to get them a converting enzyme inhibitor. And from your own experience and from data from UKPDS, from metformin, the question mark is that it is not a contemporary trial, UKPDS, and the benefit was shown in the extension. And we may have, from until the end of this meeting, another proof of benefit. Now, there is no proven benefit with these agents on macrovascular. Again, I am only concentrating on macrovascular. And within this category of drug, we have at least a good evidence of safety with DPP-4 inhibitors, and maybe with Origin, also with insulin glargine. There are lots of other candidates which are on the way. Some of them are going to be submitted to trials as well, but we will have a large number of trials that I'm pretty sure that what has started so far is only a door opener, and we will have many more of these trials. And in the future, we will have head-to-head comparison among various anti-diabetic therapy. And actually, I understand that the new, National Institute of Health in the United States is going to be also organizing these 4 or 5 arms head-to-head first choice therapy in order to find out and answer this question, which drug we should start with now that we have the choice of metformin and maybe the SGLT2 inhibitor and also other safe therapy. So what else? And the what else is actually challenging the FDA regulations and guidance. I believe personally that this is now outdated. We have a good record of safety of many drugs, and we should move on really now to efficacy trials. Now, of course, diabetologists and yourself say, well, diabetes is just a different disease. It's not like atherosclerosis related to lipids or hypertension. So it's not only a story of unstable plaque or thrombus, it's glycation, which is the culprit, and you need to wait for long before you can really prevent cardiovascular events. This may be true, but no industry would embark into a 10-year or 15 years duration trial unless there is a different concept and different conceptual framework, which is being discussed right now with regulatory agencies. In a way, the European agency is going this direction with the post-approval trials long-term, but this may be solved not only actually in diabetes, in many other areas, if the patent life of a drug is prolonged, provided the industry who has got this prolonged patent life embarks into long-term efficacy start. So this is maybe the future, but for now, it's really great that diabetes is now being submitted to outcome trials, and it's really important for our patient and very important for our area to start doing actually evidence-based therapy. Thank you very much for your attention.